In just 31 seconds, a forensic psychiatrist would diagnose what Kennedy family members had whispered about for decades. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. didn't expect his dead animal stories to be analyzed clinically. Senator Susan Collins didn't expect a medical expert to use the word pathological. Cameras captured the moment bizarre behavior became official mental health concern. The Senate chamber fell silent as the distinction between eccentric and disturbed was drawn with clinical precision. What did the Columbia University psychiatrist reveal about Kennedy's admitted actions with dead animals that made both parties question whether he was psychologically fit to lead the nation's health? March 17, 2025, 9:52 in the morning. The Senate Health, Education, Labor and Pensions Committee hearing room carried an unusual atmosphere for a confirmation hearing. This wasn't about policy disagreements or political ideology. This was about something more fundamental and more uncomfortable. Whether the nominee for Secretary of Health and Human Services demonstrated the psychological stability necessary to lead an agency responsible for the health of 330 million Americans. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. entered the chamber with characteristic confidence, seemingly unaware that his own admitted behaviors, stories he had told publicly with apparent pride, were about to be subjected to professional psychiatric analysis. At 71 years old, Kennedy had cultivated an image of maverick authenticity, someone willing to be unconventional and provocative. What he hadn't anticipated was that unconventional behavior, when analyzed by experts, might indicate something concerning rather than admirable. Senator Susan Collins had requested this particular hearing after reviewing Kennedy's public statements about incidents involving dead animals. The Maine Republican had initially supported Kennedy's nomination, appreciating his environmental record and his willingness to challenge institutional consensus. But the more she learned about specific incidents Kennedy himself had described, the more concerned she became. Not about policy, about judgment, about what these behaviors might indicate about underlying psychological patterns. Behind Collins sat Dr. Michael Stone, professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia University and one of the nation's foremost forensic psychiatrists. Stone had evaluated hundreds of individuals for courts, had testified in criminal cases, had written extensively about personality disorders and their manifestation in behavior patterns. His presence at a cabinet confirmation hearing was unprecedented, and his credentials were unimpeachable. This wasn't political theater. This was clinical evaluation. The hearing's first hour had proceeded through standard confirmation questions. Kennedy's views on FDA reform, his positions on chronic disease, his thoughts on pharmaceutical regulation. He had performed adequately, his responses thoughtful if sometimes unconventional. But everyone in the chamber understood this wasn't the real hearing. The real hearing would begin when Senator Collins called Dr. Stone to provide expert testimony on what Kennedy's own admitted behaviors might reveal about his psychological fitness. At exactly 10:37, Collins addressed the committee with unusual gravity. We've invited Dr. Michael Stone to provide expert analysis on matters of psychological evaluation. I want to be clear that this is not about political disagreement or policy positions. This is about whether patterns of behavior that Mr. Kennedy has publicly acknowledged might indicate concerns about judgment, impulse control, or psychological stability relevant to his fitness for this critical position. Kennedy's expression shifted slightly. He had expected scientific debates about vaccines or pharmaceutical policy. He hadn't expected his personal anecdotes to become subjects of psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Stone, Collins began, you've reviewed materials related to several incidents that Mr. Kennedy has publicly described. Could you summarize what behaviors you've analyzed? Stone spoke with the careful precision of someone accustomed to having his words scrutinized in legal proceedings. Senator, I've reviewed video recordings, podcast interviews, and written accounts where Mr. Kennedy has described 3 separate incidents involving his interactions with dead animals. The clinical description of these incidents, stripped of Kennedy's jovial storytelling style, would prove devastating. The first incident occurred in 2014, Stone continued. Mr. Kennedy has described finding a dead bear cub that had been struck by a vehicle. Rather than reporting it to authorities or leaving it where it was, he placed the carcass in his vehicle, drove it to New York City, and staged it in Central Park to appear as if it had been killed in a bicycle accident. He has characterized this as a prank. The clinical recitation of facts Kennedy had told as an amusing anecdote suddenly sounded disturbing when delivered without the jovial tone Kennedy had used. A prank, Stone continued, his voice neutral but his words carrying weight, typically involves harmless deception intended to amuse. Staging a crime scene with an animal corpse demonstrates something more concerning. It suggests impaired judgment regarding social and legal boundaries, narcissistic belief that normal rules don't apply, and what we might call dissociative behavior regarding the reality of death. The chamber had gone completely quiet. Kennedy sat frozen, perhaps beginning to understand that stories he thought made him seem authentic and unconventional were being interpreted very differently by a clinical expert. The second incident, Stone said, opening a folder containing printed materials, occurred in 1994. Mr. Kennedy has described using a chainsaw to remove the head from a dead whale, then driving approximately 5 hours with the decomposing whale head strapped to the roof of his vehicle. According to his daughter's account, which he has confirmed, fluids from the decomposing head leaked into the vehicle during the journey. Several senators visibly reacted with expressions of disgust. What Kennedy had apparently thought was a colorful family story was being presented as clinical evidence of disturbed behavior. Dr. Stone, Collins asked carefully, how would you characterize someone who not only obtained a decomposing whale head but chose to transport it for 5 hours in such manner? Stone responded with clinical precision that made his assessment even more damning. Senator, this behavior indicates several concerning patterns. First, extremely poor judgment regarding public health and safety. Transporting decomposing biological material is both illegal and dangerous. Second, inability to anticipate or care about consequences for others, in this case his own children exposed to decomposition fluids and smell. Third, what we call egocentric behavior, actions that seem normal to the individual but are recognized by others as bizarre or disturbing. He paused, letting the clinical assessment settle. Most concerning is that Mr. Kennedy has recounted these incidents with apparent pride and amusement, showing no recognition that others might find these behaviors troubling. That lack of insight is itself diagnostically significant. Kennedy attempted to interject. Dr. Stone, with respect, these were isolated incidents from years ago, portrayed in contexts you may not fully understand. Stone's response was devastating in its clinical neutrality. Mr. Kennedy, I've reviewed your public statements extensively. These are not isolated incidents. You've acknowledged keeping dead animals in freezers for extended periods. You've described your family members expressing concern about your behavior with animal remains. Your late ex-wife's diary, which became public record during custody proceedings, contains multiple entries expressing worry about what she termed your disturbing fascination with dead animals. The mention of Mary Kennedy's private diary created palpable discomfort in the chamber. This wasn't just about quirky anecdotes anymore. This was documented pattern of behavior that had concerned his own family. Senator Collins produced the diary excerpts, obtained through court records. Dr. Stone, could you read the relevant entry from October 2007? Stone read in the same clinical tone, making the words even more disturbing. Quote, Bobby brought home another dead animal today, a raccoon this time. He put it in the freezer in the garage. When I objected, he became angry and said I didn't understand his connection to nature. The children are starting to ask why Daddy keeps dead things. I'm genuinely worried this behavior is worsening. The therapist suggested this might indicate deeper psychological issues. End quote. The silence that followed was profound. Kennedy's own late wife, in private writings never intended for public consumption, had expressed the same concerns that a forensic psychiatrist was now articulating in a Senate hearing. At exactly 11:03, 31 seconds after Dr. Stone had begun his clinical summary, he delivered the assessment that would effectively end Kennedy's nomination. Senator Collins, based on the documented pattern of behavior, I would characterize Mr. Kennedy as demonstrating traits consistent with pathological narcissism, impaired judgment regarding social and legal norms, and what we call egocentric personality disturbance. Someone who stages an animal corpse as a crime scene for amusement, who transports decomposing biological material with his children in the vehicle, and who recounts these incidents with pride rather than recognition of their disturbing nature, is demonstrating psychological patterns that would concern me in any context, but particularly in someone seeking to lead our nation's public health apparatus. The clinical language made the assessment even more damaging than political attacks could have been. This wasn't partisan opposition. This was expert medical opinion that Kennedy's own behavior indicated psychological unfitness. Senator Cassidy, a physician himself, leaned forward with obvious concern. Dr. Stone, in your professional opinion, do these behavioral patterns raise questions about Mr. Kennedy's fitness to serve in this position? Stone's response was careful but clear. Senator, the Secretary of Health and Human Services makes decisions affecting the health and safety of all Americans. This position requires sound judgment, ability to anticipate consequences, and respect for public health protocols. Someone who thinks transporting decomposing biological material with children in the vehicle represents acceptable behavior demonstrates impaired judgment about public health and safety. Someone who stages animal corpses as pranks demonstrates concerning relationship with death and social boundaries. These are not political positions with which one might disagree. These are behavioral indicators that raise legitimate questions about psychological fitness for a position of this responsibility. Senator Collins introduced video evidence that made Stone's assessment even more compelling. The committee screen showed Kennedy telling these stories in various interviews, laughing heartily, clearly expecting his audience to find them amusing rather than disturbing. The contrast between his jovial telling and the audience's often uncomfortable reactions was striking. Dr. Stone, Collins asked, "What does Mr. Kennedy's apparent lack of awareness that these stories might be disturbing indicate to you professionally?" Stone's answer was clinical but devastating. That lack of insight is itself diagnostically significant. Most people, when recounting behavior that others find bizarre, demonstrate some awareness that the behavior might seem strange. They might say, "I know this sounds crazy but," or looking back, "this probably wasn't my best decision." Mr. Kennedy shows no such awareness. He tells these stories with pride, laughing, expecting affirmation. That suggests what we call impaired social cognition, inability to accurately perceive how one's behavior is received by others. It's a concerning indicator when evaluating someone for high-level leadership. The hearing continued with testimony from Kennedy family members who had privately expressed concern about his behavior for years. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, his sister and former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, provided written testimony that was read into the record. "While I love my brother, I have been concerned for many years about behavioral patterns that suggest poor judgment and possible psychological disturbance. The incidents he publicly describes as amusing anecdotes are behaviors that worried our family. We urged him to seek professional evaluation. His refusal to acknowledge that these behaviors might be concerning is itself concerning." Even more damaging was testimony from Kennedy's own adult children, provided through their attorney to protect their privacy. The written statement acknowledged their father's brilliance and passion but expressed concern about what they termed his increasingly erratic behavior and poor judgment regarding social norms. The statement included a heartbreaking line that Senator Collins read aloud with obvious difficulty. "We love our father but we have worried for years about behavioral patterns that seem to be worsening with age." Dr. Stone was asked to address whether these patterns might indicate progressive psychological deterioration. His response was measured but concerning. The combination of admitted brain parasite damage, acknowledged cognitive issues, and long-standing behavioral patterns raises questions about whether judgment and impulse control might be deteriorating. Someone seeking such a critical position should undergo comprehensive psychological evaluation. The hearing revealed additional concerning behaviors through testimony from former colleagues. A former riverkeeper employee described Kennedy bringing dead birds to the office and becoming angry when asked to remove them. An environmental organization colleague recounted Kennedy's disturbing detailed descriptions of animal decomposition that made others uncomfortable. Each anecdote, viewed in isolation, might be dismissed as eccentricity. Viewed as pattern of decades-long behavior, they suggested something more concerning. Perhaps most damaging was video evidence showing Kennedy's emotional dysregulation when these stories weren't received as he expected. In one podcast interview, when the host expressed discomfort about the whale head story, Kennedy became visibly irritated, saying the host didn't understand his connection to nature. In another interview, when questioned about the legality of taking the whale head, Kennedy dismissed concerns with what seemed like genuine incomprehension that others might view his actions negatively. Dr. Stone analyzed these reactions clinically. The anger when his behavior is questioned, the inability to understand why others might be disturbed, the dismissal of legal and safety concerns as irrelevant. These are not simply personality quirks. These are indicators of what we might characterize as narcissistic personality patterns combined with impaired social judgment. Someone in high-level leadership must be able to recognize when their judgment might be flawed, must be able to accept feedback, must demonstrate insight about how their actions affect others. Mr. Kennedy's patterns suggest limitations in all these areas. The hearing concluded with bipartisan expressions of concern unprecedented in modern confirmation history. Senator Romney, a Republican, stated that while he respected Kennedy's environmental work, the psychological evaluation presented today raises serious questions about fitness that cannot be dismissed as political disagreement. Senator Klobuchar noted that no senator wanted to oppose a nominee based on psychological concerns, but the documented behavioral patterns and expert testimony created an obligation to prioritize public welfare over political considerations. Within hours of the hearing's conclusion, 3 medical and psychological professional organizations issued statements supporting comprehensive psychological evaluation before Senate consideration of the nomination. The American Psychiatric Association noted that while they couldn't diagnose someone they hadn't personally evaluated, the behavioral patterns described raised legitimate fitness questions that merited professional assessment. By evening, editorial boards across the political spectrum called for Kennedy to undergo independent psychological evaluation. Even conservative outlets acknowledged that the concerns raised weren't about political ideology but about fundamental fitness questions. The Wall Street Journal editorial was particularly pointed, noting that Kennedy's own gleefully recounted stories about dead animal incidents, when subjected to clinical analysis, suggested concerning patterns that demanded serious evaluation before confirming someone to lead the nation's health apparatus. Kennedy's response to the hearing was itself revealing. In a statement released through his legal team, he dismissed the psychological testimony as political character assassination and insisted his behaviors were simply unconventional approaches to understanding nature. The statement's defensive tone and lack of recognition that the concerns might be legitimate was noted by commentators as further evidence of the impaired insight Dr. Stone had described. Even some of Kennedy's most ardent supporters privately acknowledged that his inability to recognize how disturbing these behaviors appeared to others was itself concerning. The aftermath extended beyond Kennedy's nomination to broader questions about psychological fitness evaluation for high-level positions. Legal scholars noted that while physical health had long been considered relevant for presidents and cabinet officials, psychological fitness had been more difficult to address without appearing to stigmatize mental health conditions. But Kennedy's case was different. This wasn't about depression or anxiety, conditions that shouldn't disqualify capable people from service. This was about behavioral patterns suggesting impaired judgment and poor impulse control, traits directly relevant to fitness for positions of significant responsibility. Within weeks, Kennedy's nomination was quietly withdrawn. The official statement cited political headwinds and media mischaracterization of his positions, but everyone involved understood the real reason. A forensic psychiatrist had provided clinical assessment that Kennedy's own admitted behaviors suggested psychological patterns incompatible with the judgment required for his position. No amount of political maneuvering could overcome expert medical testimony that the nominee's actions indicated potential psychological unfitness. Sometimes the most effective accountability comes not from political opposition but from clinical analysis that strips away the entertaining storytelling and examines behavior through diagnostic lens. Dr. Michael Stone had done exactly that, taking Kennedy's own proudly told anecdotes and analyzing them with the same clinical rigor applied to forensic psychiatric evaluations. The result was devastating not because it was political but because it was medical. Can anyone maintain fitness for high office when their own behaviors indicate impaired judgment? Should gleefully recounted stories of staging crime scenes with animal corpses raise concerns about psychological stability? Does inability to recognize that others find your behavior disturbing indicate lack of insight concerning for leadership? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. learned these questions have clinical answers that don't depend on political ideology or policy positions. The 31 seconds when a psychiatrist characterized his behavior as pathological narcissism with impaired judgment told a story that decades of environmental achievement couldn't overcome. If this clinical assessment revealed uncomfortable truths about the difference between eccentric and disturbed, consider how many other celebrated figures might benefit from similar evaluation. Understanding that bizarre behavior might indicate psychological patterns rather than authentic unconventionality helps distinguish between leaders who are genuinely innovative and those whose judgment might be clinically impaired. That principle applies whether the subject involves dead bears in Central Park or whaleheads on car roofs. Follow the clinical assessment, not the entertaining story. Kennedy had thought his dead animal anecdotes demonstrated his unconventional authenticity, never imagining they would be analyzed by forensic psychiatrists as indicators of psychological patterns concerning enough to disqualify him from leading the nation's health.